Lennon Flowers, welcome to the new school. It's great to have you here. Lennon arrived in Bolinas with one of our board members, Janet, who's also here tonight. And it was introduced to Michael Lerner, the founder of Commonweal, and myself in a long conversation in his office, in his library, where we learned a lot about this project that Lennon is engaged in called the Dinner Party. But before we dive into the dinner party, can you just tell us about your story, where you came from? How did you end up being here today?
There's a small question for you. So I think for me to answer that accurately, you have to kind of, I think I have to go back to the beginning, and don't worry, it won't be forever. The gasps in the room. But I think, so I grew up in North Carolina, in Raleigh, and I grew up kind of straddling two worlds from a very early age. One of those worlds was middle-class suburban Raleigh, and an extraordinarily comfortable, we had everything that we needed world. I was the daughter, my parents divorced when I was fairly early, and my mother very quickly kind of took on the fierce lioness mentality of single working moms in the world, and even after remarrying, never kind of fully lost that. So that was kind of one part, and it was, a world in which she had kind of vowed and reinforced for us from an early age that we could go forth and do anything that we wanted to. It was the 90s. But then the other world was actually, and story that I kind of learned to inhabit was more hers. And she had grown up in Eastern North Carolina in tobacco country amidst really deep poverty. And so I think it was from a really early age of going, to kind of family gatherings and visiting every couple of months that I, began to kind of see a very different set of circumstances than the ones that I inhabited on a daily basis. And through that, and through, one of the motherisms that kind of stuck with me was, that notion of there but for the grace of God go I. This coming from a woman who was avowedly agnostic her entire life, but I think beginning from an early age to recognize the way in which we tend to conflate circumstance and potential, and don't see potential because of what is masked by circumstance, and people who feel very shut down or never have kind of the opportunity to really thrive, and to be kind of genetically related and in very kind of close association to that, to realize the very kind of thin lines that separate us all. And through worlds of difference was, I think, a part of that kind of origin story. And then, for the context and setting tonight, at the age of 17, my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And I was, at the time, hell-bent on getting as far out of North Carolina as quickly as possible, kind of a theater kid. And from that moment forward, so for really the last kind of dozen years, everything took a decidedly different turn. And I ended up going to school about 30 minutes down the road, staying very close, and she passed away she was diagnosed my senior year of high school, passed away my senior year of college, and throughout that period and thereafter, my kind of coping mechanism, my means for, showing up in the world had been to get really, really busy and stay that way, and use that as a distraction. And so it was, thereafter, and I think finding within, out of that experience, kind of a hunger to go out and do, and to use that both in a way that powered me forward, but also, proved kind of a powerful source of distractions and alienation from what became a very big part of my story, was, the kind of origins here. And then shortly, a couple years after graduation, moved out to California, met on my first day in the office a woman named Carla, and as we were walking back from coffee a few months later, she unearthed the fact that her father had passed away of brain cancer about 6 months before. And that was the first moment that I saw anybody else among my peer community who'd been through the same experience of losing a parent. And it was the first moment that this part of my story that I had kind of run from and kept very intentionally hidden from view became, in fact, a source of real connectivity. and a source of conversation, and something that felt kind of amazing to share. And to recognize, how good on the other side of it I had gotten at the kind of avoiding the deer in headlights reactions.
Right. So after that experience, that's what led you on the path to the dinner party.
Yeah. So we, after meeting, it was a couple months after that, or weeks, she invited a group of women who had all lost parents over for dinner one night. Mm-hmm. The origin story of the dinner party is that we had absolutely no intention of ever starting the dinner party. This, really grew out of personal experience and that kind of hunger for community. And I think all of us, that night kind of knocked very timidly on the door, went through the kind of flaky routines that are, that my generation is in part known for, like, maybe I could find an excuse to not go tonight. This sounds really scary for all of us who had been kind of very adept at avoiding that part of our stories. Instead, what we found in the course of that evening was an extraordinary recognition of ourselves in each other and in the other people around that table. And so we talked until 2 a.m, and it was a Sunday, and everyone had work the next morning, so we piled into our bed. And then at 6 a.m, Michelle, who was a nurse, went off, to her job, and we just kept doing it because it felt really, really good.
And when you're talking about your generation, I'm really curious about this generation that some people call the millennial generation, which are the people that are after high school or after college, before they have families. They're in this in-between space, often in their 20s and 30s. And you're talking about how your generation deals with loss might be different than previous generations. And I'm wondering, do you have any observations around how maybe this generation might be dealing with this differently?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting that on the one hand, I think generationally we are the product of kind of a culture of banality, and that it is very easy and very dangerous at times to kind of express, hidden parts of yourselves, and so that we kind of live in, and everything that's talked about that, it's easy to kind of project an image here. Right. And to want to cling as hard as possible to that image. And because you see everybody else kind of projecting that particular image, in their own Facebook feeds and beyond, it begins to create, a false reality where everyone is kind of wearing a set of masks and you don't see beneath that surface. At the same time, I also think that generationally we are ready and hungry for, and I think you see this coming out in a number of different ways, to talk openly about, subjects that have otherwise been tabooed. And so you see this kind of opening up of conversation about race and gender identity and sexuality, and topics that, have been kind of no-nos in previous age. And so I think the combination of those two tensions, at times you see people having, I think, an easier time. I look at my parents' generation, and the stoicism of the generation that came before them, and there weren't a lot of spaces to kind of openly talk about that which was to be kept private, and back at home and dealt with within the family. And I think that generationally, because we're not living with our families, we're not often, typically the new norm is not that you live in the same kind of neighborhood and community, that people have given themselves a little bit more permission to kind of explore their own road, and to share that openly as individuals. But then I think that there's a number of kind of forces that play a counteractive role, if that makes sense.
It does, and on that same line, death and loss have often been in the realm of spirituality and faith. So communities of faith would have ways to deal with grief, that have ways to deal with marking that moment and having different rituals around it. In the tradition that I come from, we sit Shiva. We sit for 7 days and you mourn and you mark the grieving at different time periods. And it seems to me that maybe within the generation that you're talking about, is if you take the Bay Area as a place, a little bit of a gold rush where people are coming from all over the world to the dot-com explosion. People are leaving those communities of faith. They're leaving those old traditions. And maybe there's a connection between that sense of you no longer have the containers to hold that set of emotions.
Absolutely. Well, I think, when I think of our grandparents' generation, they found their comfort, particularly, around grief and loss, through church community, and through the ceremony, be it of a funeral or various kind of religious practices and a physical grave site that you could return to. I think presently we're living in a time in which there aren't rituals. And so people are seeking in each other and in these kind of modern communities what, what previously was very place-based and permanent, but also very institutional. And I think when you look at it, our generation is kind of famous for its disengagement from institutions, that we're fleeing organized religion and political parties en masse, and identifying more and more as political independence. We're spiritual rather than claiming a religion as our own. And yet I think when you kind of dig below the surface, it's not a matter that people are asking fewer questions than they did once upon a time, or seeking, are any less inclined to ask big questions about why are we here on Earth, or are any more really apathetic about, what's happening in the world. It's that they're simply mistrustful of those institutions that used to govern kind of how we operate. And so I think the figuring out of kind of new community and how we create these spaces that are sacred, how in an age of information accessibility, where we can, surface rituals and practices that have been, held by different communities, throughout time. Humans have been dying for a really, really long time, and some of them have been doing a better job of it than we do now. And I think the kind of craving to find, to name that which, doesn't feel safe in kind of daily conversation. People are, picking and choosing in the same way that we pick and choose our modern family in the places where we land. We're picking and choosing different rituals and practices, that feed us. And that's one thing that we've really found, is that there is this kind of sense of DIY for how we kind of each create our own roadmaps.
So the DIY being the do-it-yourself. So in a sense,
translation.
Do your own ritual, or create your own container, which in a sense, I guess that's what the dinner party is. So can you tell us what happens at a dinner party?
Yeah, absolutely. So the dinner party, in simplest terms, is a group of mostly 20 and 30-somethings who've each experienced some form of significant loss. And for us, that typically is a parent, a partner, a sibling, in some cases a really close friend, and come together over dinner tables to talk about it. You talk about ritual. I think the one kind of ritual that has stayed present in all of our lives across all cultural and economic lines is food and food practices as a means of bringing people together. And so, still the kind of core part of our story really hasn't changed from that very first dinner on that very first deck in Echo Park, Los Angeles, back then, that it is about kind of the creation of intimate, warm feelings, that spaces where it feels comfortable and safe to kind of expose the parts of ourselves that, we generally keep under lock and key. And using that as kind of a means of exploring both the kind of ugly truths and realities and parts of our stories that, around which we feel shame or othered by, or simply deeply uncomfortable and, pained and saddened by, to be able to name that and to feel comfortable in doing so and to feel heard. But then simultaneously, how do you create a space where people can also explore, what this is teaching them about, how they want to spend their time on Earth?
I'm just curious, you're saying that there's some shame around the lost, and before that you also said that there's a certain taboo around the lost, and that's at least in my generation, there was not a taboo about talking about death or about loss, and I'm curious about that. What is the shame that where does it come from? Why is it a taboo for people in their 20s and 30s? I understand why it's hard to deal with, right? So Dr. Remen works with medical students who are in their early 20s, and these are physicians who are going out of the world at the age of 26, and death is part of their daily life. And that's, I could see the challenge of how do you deal with grief and how do you deal with loss, and I can see the the storm of emotions that goes with it, but I'm curious about the shame and the taboo around it. Why is there a sense of, like, I've heard you before talking about there's almost a coming out sense about loss. Where does that come from?
I think, I think the taboo is related to a number of different forces. Most kind of particularly, I can use my own story as an example. Like when I was 24 and met Carla for the first time and found that there was another person, quote unquote, like me, or who'd been through a very different set of stories and experiences, and obviously very different characters in the play. And I think for us, realizing that no two stories are ever the same, even within a family. But that kind of recognition was profound because I thought it was the first time that it was ever happening to me. Now, the reality was I had actually known other people who had lost parents young, who had been through similar kind of experiences, but because all of us were so good at not talking about it, because we'd had that one experience where you do share, and whether it's, at a kind of casual cocktail party or, just hanging out with friends, it kills a conversation instantly. The person goes to the punch bowl or its proverbial equivalent, and you're like, okay, well, I know not to do that again. And so I think that it becomes kind of reinforcing for all of us. And it's been a learning journey for us to realize that the other part of that taboo, the reason that people go through the act of, that we feel shut down by the way in which that story is received, is not because people are inherently deeply uncomfortable even talking about this. It's that you don't know what to say. It's that because nobody else is doing it, we don't have vocabulary, we don't have ritual, we don't have other examples that we can draw upon. And so we don't know how to be helpful, and so the responses go away. And I think that every time that kind of message, however subtly, is kind of reinforced, it does create a feeling of shame or simply otherness. And there is, what we find is that there are kind of two pathways, to vastly oversimplify, that a person, particularly when young and going through this experience at a time in which it's not predicted, and very few people within their peer groups are going through it as well, that you have that there are kind of two pathways that can happen, and one is the kind of victimizing narrative, in which, oh, my life would have been all of these things but for the following happening, and then the other is that it kind of invites a window in which you can reflect about how you want to use your time on Earth. And typically, all of our language is geared towards the kind of first bucket of grief and I'm so sorry and like the pity face, when the kind of rich territory to explore is about, being comfortable with discomfort, but also making space to talk about the second kind of pathway and what are you learning out of that experience.
So the difference between the dinner party and the cocktail party is that the cocktail party, if you're coming out or you share about a loss, the people around you don't know how to deal with it, and that's where the otherness comes, and that eventually gets translated into shame and into taboo, so you don't bring it up because you don't want to separate yourself from the group. But at the dinner party, I know that something else happens, and actually maybe we can start with reading the manifesto. How did that come to be?
Well, so this was actually really interesting. Again, once we kind of realized slowly as people were hearing about it through friends and friends of friends, and oh, I know this guy, who might be interested in coming to a dinner one night, and or hosting, a table in a different city, we began to kind of realize that this, story that each of us had individually thought that we carried alone, and then discovered was actually a shared story within a table of people, was actually part of a much bigger shared story. And so it was interesting for us, after beginning to open the doors, to this and to invite in those, who were hungering for the same kind of community in the same space, to air that experience. We, after a period of time, actually began to realize that the kind of tribe of people, for whom this experience was relevant, and something that, was of value, wasn't just everybody who had experienced a loss. It was people who were seeking a particular kind of community, a particular kind of, forward movement and direction, and that ability, to absolutely 100%, stay away from any form of advice giving. They weren't looking to be fixed. Right. They weren't looking to be healed. And so we needed a means through which we could kind of put out the call to find other people who could raise their hand, to that set of sentiments. So that gave birth to our manifesto.
I can't help, when you're talking, I just reflect on the Cancer Help Program at Commonwealth. Because so many of the way that you're talking about how you're building this place to have a conversation around the topic that you can't talk with people who are not experiencing it.
Right.
So a lot of this, how do you create this wholeness of the conversation? It's just always resonating.
Absolutely.
But yes, let me try and read this. So we are dinner partiers. We know what it is to lose a loved one, and we're not afraid to talk about it. We hold the following truths to be self-evident. Life after loss is forever different than life before. Grief isn't linear, and moving forward is not the same as moving on. There is no roadmap, no game plan. You're your own best expert. This journey is yours alone, but you are not alone in journeying. You've got this. And then the commitments. The commitments we make to each other are simple. We will abstain from bullshit. And then the font is too small.
No whitewashing loss, no standing on platitudes, no pitying. We will speak our own truth and listen deeply, openly, thoughtfully as others speak theirs. We believe in thriving, not just surviving. We will not avoid the pain, but we will also seek out the joy. We will see each other through our worst days and use them to create our best days. We'll take damn good care of ourselves and of each other. We will eat well, drink well, live well, love well. Look around the table and pull up a chair.
Amen. This could be a motto for many of us. That's wonderful. It feels like, you just created the space just by reading that.
Yeah.
So maybe let's dive in. So what happens if I was to show up at a dinner party? What would I see? What would happen? What would be my experience?
So we've, the kind of process from that very first table through where we are today, where there are presently 31 tables in different parts of the country, has been a matter of figuring that out. And what are the kind of key principles that are shared across every table, recognizing that every dinner is going to look differently from every other one, even if it's the same kind of group of people meeting. All of our, where we are in our respective journeys is different from gathering to gathering. But there are some consistencies. So when you walk in, the way in which it works, everything is a potluck dinner party. And part of the reason for that is that it's cheap. But more importantly, it gives people a real sense of ownership. In the early days, we would, slave away in a kitchen trying to make everything and being really, really frantic, and of course we're constantly running behind, and then realized that actually people were really hungry to be able to contribute something. So that was kind of number one, and actually that kind of gave birth to our second big insight, that when you first come in, the kind of design is such that you can be very cognizant suddenly of the amount of kind of care that has gone into creating this experience, right. And that there's something there that is ready to take your breath away, but also simultaneously that things are a little bit left undone, because it helps, I think, in easing into a conversation. There's a guy named Parker Palmer, the founder of the Center for Courage and Renewal, who's been a huge source of inspiration and a guide in a lot of this, has kind of a saying about approaching this from the slant. That if you demand the soul show up, it's going to do everything but, right. So how do you kind of create within those first few minutes a real feeling of intimacy that, after that moment when your stomach clenches and you knock on the door and, oh God, am I ready for this kind of experience? We'll pour you a glass of wine, there's appetizers, there's food, and there's a few things that everybody can do and again kind of occupy their hands with. And then once the table is set, and candles are lit, We invite our host. So for every dinner party, there is a host.
And they're trained facilitators?
Yeah. So we do. So we just began our first trainings, and share with each host kind of a set of principles and practices that we found helpful. In going through this process, and it was a surprising learning for us that simply bringing everybody together with a shared expectation. They were all there for the same reasons. Even so, the taboos that we have against talking about this are so strong that unless somebody starts, we will continue to talk about the weather in perpetuity. And so finding people who are really gifted, that kind of natural art of modern hosting at both opening up with their own truth and their own story. And that's, our first ask of every host, is that you have to really want to be a part of this community, that it's not showing up because you want to be helpful to other people, who are in a state that you were in, years ago, but where are you on this path, and are you, comfortable of naming that and expressing your own real vulnerability. And then the second piece to that is, are you able to be a container, and a space holder for other people as they share their truths. So the host, go through a process of, raising glasses, to those who brought us together around a table, and to everybody who, had the courage to show up that night. And then if it's the first dinner, we introduce kind of a set of principles, very, very simple guidelines, to keep in mind in having that conversation. But otherwise, it's unstructured and no agenda.
So the dinner just flows.
The dinner flows. I think the invitation and question that, we start with and informally is, where are you right now? And that was actually an interesting thing that we began to see after those first couple of dinners, was that our conversations began to switch from past tense to present. And that we had been, coming in the beginning, sharing the kind of context that brought us all together, and the moment of diagnosis, if, it was, or the, for losses that were surprise and, the product of accidents, whatever it happened to be, sharing that kind of context, where you were, how old you were, but really the story that you'd repeated probably 1,000 times and kind of hit the top line bullet points. And then we began to see that there was this that the interesting conversations were actually what happened afterwards, as people began to open up about, where they were in their jobs or in relationships, and what was the moment to bring it up. The daddy issues that you were having with your boss, the struggle that would certainly arise around the holidays if there was no home and family to go back to, or if that home and family were a very, very different, took a very different form from the one that you knew. And we found that when you, open that kind of question, people actually do have a lot to say and to share.
So you're building, it's not a therapy group, it's not a support group, it's a community of support.
Exactly.
Is it the same group of people get together over time, and it's happening in 40 cities? I want to open it up to everybody so we can all ask questions, but I'd like to ask one more question, which is, concerning there's a lot of other people of your generation that that have not experienced loss, at least not that they can remember, or at least not out of sequence in the sense of a partner or a parent. What do they have to learn from the work that you've been doing?
I think one of the interesting things that we found through all of this, and we're just beginning to see this now, we released a toolkit a few months ago, because we realized pretty quickly that we couldn't control this, that we could share kind of principles for what worked, but we would never physically be in the room, we couldn't be in 5 rooms at once within one city, let alone, in Indianapolis or McAllen, Texas. So sharing tools to make it easier for people, to sit down with others with a shared experience and have a conversation and build community out of that. And realized that kind of our end goal was, not that every person in America who's experienced loss before they should is sitting down for a dinner party, capital letters, but that actually we feel normed and comfortable talking openly about these experiences with others who have shared that. And what's been really interesting to realize is that we've begun to kind of see people applying those principles, applying those tools to subjects that actually aren't related to death loss itself, whether that's to divorce. We have our first table emerging around miscarriage, but we've also seen conversations emerge around questions of gender identity and sexuality, among parents and their children. Any kind of topic that we, by definition, feel shamed and othered by, and don't have kind of spaces to comfortably talk about it. That this can be a means through which we actually, start that conversation. Right. And so I think, that my invitation and the powerful thing that we've seen out of all of this is that, and again, to go back to kind of where we were in the early days of feeling so incredibly alone and isolated by this experience, is to realize that everyone on Earth, part of the human story is that we have a story. Right. And we have something that, whether it's, what we've lived through personally, loss can take a lot of different forms beyond death loss, or something that, we've seen in a friend and wondered how to be, sources of support to that person, wondered what do you say and do, that can actually be a really powerful entry point, and that if we choose to enter that door, really extraordinary relationships can emerge, and really extraordinary conversations that are the kinds of conversations that all of us crave, that go beyond the banal, go beyond the kind of forgettable, small talk. Right. That can emerge if we give ourselves that permission.
Right. You're taking, it's beautiful, taking some very old rituals like storytelling and developing a sense of belonging, and the family dinner table, right, and weaving them together in something that is not new, something that has been happening for as long as death has been right around, and weaving that to create the kind of support that we need. I'd like to invite anybody. We're here at the New School Talk with Lennon Flowers on the Commons in Fort Mason in San Francisco. And I'd like to open it up to anybody who has questions for Lennon.
You talk about millennials and 20 to 30-year-olds being sort of the target group. And social media has given us a very different, changing, amorphous view of disclosure and privacy. It's a very changing landscape. How could you speak about that in relationship to the no bullshit maxim and what goes on in the dinner party?
Absolutely. So there's a lot to kind of unpack there. And I should say I actually struggle a lot with the word millennial. I use it kind of as shorthand because it's one that we can all recognize. But millennial, the reason I struggle with it is because it's a term with a lot of baggage, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And part of that is, like the perpetuators, and I love a good cat video of the banal, so that, it has been kind of described as the selfie generation, and a population of people that actually very rarely talk openly about real matters of privacy, and yet struggle with the way in which, privacy is daily violated by kind of tools and technology and information spread. So there's that side of it. That is perfectly true. And then there's a side of millennials, and through those very same tools, where I think we've actually seen it makes it easier sometimes to have that conversation, and that people who are uncomfortable, in physical company with somebody at a party would never necessarily raise that part of their story on a Facebook wall, or within their own kind of feed and profile, can say, this is what's happening for me today. Whether that's in the immediate aftermath of losing someone that they love, or on an anniversary, or on Mother's Day or Father's Day. And so two things are really interesting within that it gives people both permission to express their own stories, and then for every person who loves that person, and I recognize that the friends that we maintain on our Facebook pages aren't necessarily the friends with whom we would choose to sit down over a dinner table, but people are able to show up more easily, and it can be as simple as kind of the liking of a status, and recognizing and naming that I hear you in this moment. And I think the problem is if that becomes the end of the conversation, if we take our ability to comment on a status update as, you know, we've kind of done our job for showing up. But instead, I think as often you see that being the start of a conversation. And then I think the deeper kind of question is that there's only so much that can be shared on a Facebook status, you know, and kind of real questions of privacy and what do you feel comfortable kind of airing to the public. So to me, I think we don't need to vilify social media, you know, because it's here and that's the way in which we operate and tell stories, so we might as well use it well. But there will always be real value and necessity for conversations that happen in physical community and that are kind of confidential to a space. And
that's. Do you think there's room for a virtual dinner party?
That's a great question, actually. I think, you know, I think to a degree we're kind of seeing that happen, that people who haven't ever actually physically met through this community now are members of a tribe and can communicate, whether it's, you know, through Twitter or our Facebook page or, you know, you know, like various kind of host forums and these sorts of things, that there are ways to open up about that story without ever having physically been in a room with somebody. And so I think that there would be potential, you know, in certainly using this as a source of connection between people that aren't in the same place. But again, I think that the value is inherent in what happens when you can actually see someone across the table. So I think both are important, but certainly virtual can't exist without the in-person.
The virtual food would not be that.
Right, you know. Good luck getting drunk off of that.
Yeah. Julia.
Yeah, I'm curious about in the places where the dinner party was first established, are you seeing the same host showing up to host, and is there continuity? Yeah. Is it, in other words, becoming, you know, a monthly thing, an irregular thing? Are people wanting, you know, is there more, are they getting bigger? What are you just seeing? What's the organic process? I guess would be my question about when it takes.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because part of the reason that we even began, you know, focusing on building up a host community and tables that were generally closed, you know, to 8 to 12 people, and you know, we found that the ideal numbers for actually sitting down around a table and having a conversation like that, you know, were 6 to 8. And you can have a really powerful dinner party with 4 people. But the power, real power happens when people, again, are building relationships over time. And so that it's not just kind of a one-time experience with a group of strangers. There's power in that. There's power in coming together, recognizing that you're not alone. You know, the way in which we kind of air and own our stories in a one-time experience if you've never done that before. And we want to create spaces where, like, the barrier is low enough that people can, without committing to, am I going to show up on a monthly basis to this group for the next year, that they'll, you know, feel safe enough coming into that kind of community environment. So we're using that as a stepping stone, but more commonly, we are building closed tables, and so with a host and the same kind of consistent group of people. And we're just now beginning to see, you know, we're kind of at a point in our existence and have been doing this long enough that we can begin to kind of understand also the evolution of a table. And that, I think, is, and part of it we don't know entirely because it's new.
So you're
but we're
letting the table tell you what the natural, I don't know, how often a party would occur.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so I think that has been like one big learning, and particularly since this became kind of an organization, something with a URL, was that, you know, our immediate instincts, and you know, I have a certain control freak tendencies, so this has been a really important thing for me to overcome, that the organic factor is so essential because people, you know, people are looking for different things in different communities, and that moment that you feel like you're being kind of forced into or manipulated by, or here's this structure that I have to conform to, is the moment that you choose not to show up, right? That this becomes kind of too much of a barrier. And so we have tables that meet, you know, every 6 to 8 weeks. We have some that meet more quarterly and have chosen to do that. to say like, this is really, really valuable, but it also, this is heavy and significant territory, and I don't need to do it all the time, but I would love to have it as an ongoing experience. And so that is the kind of promise when we build a table, is that this isn't a one-time thing, but whether somebody chooses to do it, to a more kind of consistent schedule with like a greater degree of frequency than the other guys, that's not the point. The point is that there's a real relationship there and that it is your choice.
Are you part of a table?
I am, and so interestingly, that very same table from the early days is still a group of very dear friends of mine. One of the original members is one of my roommates, and we're all going out to Santa Barbara in a couple of weeks. But I will say, and this is the other point to Julie's question, that we're beginning to kind of realize that for a lot of the people around kind of those original tables, that first started 3 years ago, the evolution isn't that you need to come together over a formal dinner party and talk about loss each and every time, but that you can have a community of friends that you get together with,
right.
And go on hikes with, and, go out to eat, that they show up at the bigger, more fun parties. And we're really big believers that, every dinner should have an element of fun as well. But that, over time, our interest is in growing modern family, and so that you don't have to kind of meet in a structured sense, and that's a really good thing.
Yeah.
Lennon, I'm interested in your focus on your generation and whether you've thought perhaps of expanding it beyond that, the dinner party, or are you condemning the rest of us to figure it out for ourselves?
Yes, and
find your own table.
So, and I think the answer is yes to both. That in some ways, so it was surprising for us, and we assumed that the reason that this was so valuable for us was because we're really hard to find sometimes. That kind of significant loss isn't the norm. When we were among the first in our peer communities to go through this, so we needed to branch beyond our peer communities to find each other. So we figured for people, in their 50s and 60s who were going through loss as part of the shared human experience, losing their parents, that they knew other people that. We always assumed that they were talking about it. And I think the reality is that our taboos around death and dying and the scar tissue that is left by the fact that we die badly in this country isn't something that anybody talks about. Now, the kind of number one of the kind of key principles for what we're doing is that notion that no one is an expert and everyone is an expert, and you're only an expert of your own story. So we wouldn't have any place convening a table for a group outside of our generation, because that's not our landscape and our world. But we created a toolkit through which people, and we're seeing this happen, that there are tables of 50-somethings starting dinners with other 50-somethings. And, that is the kind of invitation, is how do we create shared tools and principles that each of us can apply, really truthfully back to our own community.
It's about building that crucible, to borrow a word from a good friend of mine from Commonweal. But how do you create that container to deal with those hard questions, regardless of how old you are?
Right.
Rachel?
I'm Rachel. I just wanted to ask you some questions about your generation and death. We're crazy here in America, of course. What was it Woody Allen said? In America, death is seen as optional. And I have an odd experience. For the last 25 years, I've taught a course called The Healer's Art. And it's now in 90 medical schools in 7 foreign countries. It's a 15-hour elective discovery model, pure process course. And the people in it are the people you're talking about. They're 23 to 32, so in their somewhere. And in this course, and people are put into groups of 6 with a facilitator who's a doctor who participates as a member of the group. So you're just there basically to be sure everyone keeps listening generously to one another. And something like 2,000 students take this course every year. And the pattern is the same all the way across the country. And my curiosity is, these are medical students. Is this a medical student thing? Or is this a young person thing? And I don't know. So here's the pattern. For 5 hours of the 15 hours, these circles, which stay the same, little groups stay the same for the whole 15 hours. For 5 hours, they talk about death and loss. And they tell each other their stories. And the first hour is always the same. I'm too young to have lost anything. I can't think of anything I have lost. And they're very sincere. I mean, no one's looking for a place to talk about death and loss at all. And then the second session, we ask people to bring an object that might be related to any loss or any disappointment in their lives. And I'll give you a classic example. The last circle that I led in this group, there was a young man who said, well, my mother died when I was 2, but I was too young to know her, so I haven't lost anything. That's the kind of remark, and that's a pattern. And so I asked the group, and all the others were doing very similar things, not quite as dramatic as that. I asked the group to bring an object with them that related to whatever it was they were talking about for about 3 seconds, each, to the next session. So he brings a photograph of a beautiful young woman. And he puts it down in the middle of the circle. We're sitting on the road. Puts it down in the middle of the circle. And there's silence. And the group begins to cry. The group begins to cry. And he is sitting there. And then he begins to cry. And we cried for 45 minutes. And I said to myself, no one is looking, this particular group, nobody is looking for a place to talk about their lives. They're not. I don't understand that. And I don't think it's because there's a doctor there sitting with these medical students, because the doctor's going to tell incredible stories, painful stories of death and loss from his own life, or her own life. And a lot of these young people are women, which makes it even more confusing for me. Most medical students are women these days. There's 60% of the medical students are young women like yourself. So I'm curious. I don't understand this pattern. Are they coming to medical school because they have such trouble with death that they're going to have to control it? Is that what causes them to say, I've never had loss? And then we spend the rest of the time talking about incredible losses that somehow they weren't thinking about.
Well, I think, first of all, the wrestling with death and dying, with death, with mortality, with the fact that we don't have forever on Earth, I think is absolutely something that is not generationally specific or limited. And that, our generation, because, and particularly if you haven't had that experience of having directly lost someone significant to you, if that story is not kind of at top of mind, you don't feel safe talking about it because you don't feel like you belong in that conversation. But, there are questions that kind of all of us wrestle with, and particularly in an age in which, what is permanence? And, I think one of the kind of defining features of this generation is that we are, choosing in a very big way as a trend to, seek out purpose and meaning in our lives, in work, and in the kinds of communities that we form. And I think a lot of that, ties back to kind of questions of what do you do with your time here? So I think that the hunger to talk about death and dying, despite the fact that there are very significant kind of taboos around that people are more interested in it than we know, than we would expect. But I also think the kind of question around loss, as a source of this kind of common currency, but not one that we know that we even like possess those stories to begin with, that you have to kind of create the containers in which we can begin to explore that, in which you can begin to see your own story differently, is a really powerful kind of notion. I'll point to an example. A dear friend of mine runs an organization in Baltimore in working in education. And this actually began out of the Johns Hopkins Medical School, and even down to undergraduates who, had that kind of life pathway planned for them, or that they had planned from the age of 18. And they're working with kids in the Baltimore County school system who are, in the bottom 5% of their class, very much on track to be dead or in jail by the time they're 18. And their kind of model and intent is, how do we build modern community and modern family around these individual kids who are deeply lost in the world and that the world has given up on? How do we create a circle of 8 to 10 students, undergraduate volunteer students, whose sole job and responsibility is to not go away? And so when the door's slammed in their faces, they come back the next morning at 7 a.m. and make sure that they're driven, to class, and they'll keep going and keep at it. And because there are many of them, there's kind of enough of a community that will power them through what is a really, really hard undertaking. The reason that it works and their success is powerful. They never lost a kid, and they have 100% high school graduation and close to 100% college. They call it 100% college entrance rate and close to 100% college graduation rate for kids that absolutely had no chance. Were told that they had no chance from birth, essentially. The reason that it works is because they begin with a process of inviting those kids and the college volunteers, and I say kids, these are high school students, so there's not a huge age differential, but they are definitely people who have, as they walk down a street, see each other as other. They begin with a conversation about loss. They begin with a conversation about what are the stories that we carry and the projections and images of difference, and realizing that it may be that somebody, who you'd never kind of expect on the surface has lost someone significant to them through death loss. It may be that they've lost some loved one to mental illness, or to alcoholism, or struggled personally with their own kind of questions of depression, and what is my value here on earth, and that is the kind of shared common currency. And out of that conversation, really powerful relationships can be born among people that have walked seemingly very, very different lives. So I think that pattern that you're seeing is not by accident.
Thank you.
Well, Lennon, we're almost at the end of our hour. What's next for the organization, for the dinner party?
So we are working toward the day in which there are 5,000 tables. So we're currently at 31. We've got a few to go, but so we've released a toolkit and are inviting in now partners and organizations who have member communities and constituencies where people are similarly looking to build community. So we're at kind of a point where we can supply the tools and the invitation for anybody who is kind of hungry to start a table or to join a table, that they can very easily do that. And I think for us, the kind of broader question, and I think we've touched on this a lot in this conversation, is that it can't just end with dinners, because that, simply closing the door with people that have lived through this doesn't actually help to do anything about the deer in headlights reaction that they've gotten, that has, kind of led them to closet that experience to begin with. So how do we culturally invite a conversation in which we talk about loss? And so we're now exploring, really excited about projects around, the kind of vagina monologues for loss. How do we give voice and space, to people across generations where we can name the stories that we don't know that we share, and use that and really explore this as common currency, and ultimately create a day in which, sharing openly situations and experiences about which you feel vulnerable with other people who've lived it is a norm.
Yes, how live I, may it be so. Lennon Flowers, thank you. You joined us for the New School Talk at the Commons in San Francisco. And if people want to find out about you, they'd go to your website.
www.thedinnerparty.org. I should also mention we are launching our second Indiegogo campaign on December 2nd.
Thank you, Mayor, very much for joining us at the New School. Good night.